Now, this strongly suggests that the effect of this virus on the Chinese economy, this global pandemic on the Chinese economy, is going to be far more damaging than the financial crisis in 08 and 09, in both relative and in absolute terms. What's up, everybody? Welcome to a special economic episode of China Update. My name is Tony. I am finally out of compulsory quarantine. It was almost 3 weeks, but I've been cleared. I do not have the coronavirus and I can finally go outside. The isolation, the quarantine policies within the People's Republic of China, particularly in key areas like the city where I work in, were particularly strict. It is nice to get outside and I'm back to work as usual. Now, for those of you who watch this channel know that I typically release a video at the end of the week, but on occasion I will release special episodes. Today we have another special episode that I need to put out because I think some of the information, some of the data that came out today is some of the most critical information to come out of China over the last month or so. So typically the National Bureau of Statistics in Beijing will release monthly data that looks at basic economic performance across a set of different metrics. It decided against releasing information in January for several reasons. One was the coronavirus, but also the effect of the Chinese New Year and what they would have on the data sets. So they decided to hold off and they would release the months of January and February together. Now, Monday afternoon in East Asia, the National Bureau of Statistics did just that. They released the economic data for the months of January and February 2020, and the information, the data was incredible. The economic data for the months of January and February of this year was far worse than even the most pessimistic forecasts. I had to write special reports for clients today, and I thought if it's important enough for my clients, it's important enough for you guys here. So we're going to quickly look at that data now on the special episode. Before we jump into that, as always, it is a massive help if you smash that like button. Because I released this material in China and we're in the middle of basically a global propaganda war with everything that's been going on, from the trade war through to the coronavirus outbreak, the YouTube algorithms automatically identifies new small channels like mine that are coming out of China as potential bots or propaganda. And so they throttle the amount of views that I can get, make it much harder. In fact, I only get about 10% of the views or 10% of the impressions that a channel of my size will typically get. But if you smash that like button, it tells the algorithm this is legitimate content from a legitimate creator. So it's a massive help if you can share or just hit that like button. Okay, let's jump into the data. Like I said, a lot of the headline numbers are pretty bad. Industrial output plunged 13.5%, fixed asset investment dropped 24.5%, and unemployment jumped over 1% to 6.2%, which is a historical high for a country that typically does not like to have high unemployment numbers, and is even less likely to admit that it has high unemployment numbers. Now, to put some of these numbers in perspective, it's important that we look at what the trend was beforehand to give you an idea of just how serious this is. If you look at retail spending, which is a key metric of demand in the People's Republic of China, since 2008, the economy has been moving more and more towards a consumption-led growth model, which means that consumer spending, consumer demand is an important engine of sustainable economic growth. If you look at monthly retail spending last year, you had issues for a year and a half with external difficulties like the trade war, but you were seeing between 7 and 8% month to month, with December of last year finishing at about 8%. Now, analysts were arguing that with January and February, that retail spend, that consumption number could drop as low as between 0.5 and 1.2% in January and February. So these were the more pessimistic views. You could see a drop from 8% to between 0.5 and 1.2, and that's from different estimations that I've seen. The actual number turns out to be negative 20%. Now, I've done my own analysis and I've looked at reports in both Chinese and English language media, and there's one phrase that really jumped out at me that I saw today, and I think this really hits the nail on the head and gives you an idea of just how bad some of this data is. And I'm going to quote it directly from Bloomberg Economics. Based on the activity data, Bloomberg Economics' newcast model shows China's GDP is tracking at about negative 20% year on year in the first 2 months. This is an extraordinarily low reading, well below our 1.2 call for quarter one and lower bound estimate of negative 4.3%. and even further behind the consensus 4% view. Now, this strongly suggests that the effect of this virus on the Chinese economy, this global pandemic on the Chinese economy, is going to be far more damaging than the financial crisis in 08 and 09, in both relative and in absolute terms. Based on this data, it is almost certain that the Chinese will see at the very least a modest contraction in their economic growth this quarter, a drop which would represent one of the biggest since the Cultural Revolution and the largest big-scale economic issues that the party is facing over the coming months will be avoiding large-scale bankruptcies and unemployment, both of which would be politically unacceptable for the party. An even more acute issue is that you're seeing a shock to demand and supply at the same time, which poses a tremendous policy risk for the government, or a policy challenge for the government rather, because there is a risk of both runaway inflation or runaway deflation if you don't have the correct policy mix and implementation on the ground. Like I said, those drops in retail spending represent a drop in demand, whereas industrial output represents a reduction in supply. Now, you're already seeing some of this manifesting itself in other numbers. Like from the last episode, we talked about how China had one of its largest trade deficits for some time, which reflected the fact that it wasn't exporting, it wasn't supplying the global market with as much as it normally would, but it still had to bring in a certain amount of imports from overseas. This could potentially continue to be an issue down the road. The fact that you have a dual demand-supply shock also means that the government needs to hold off a large stimulus package for now. It won't be able to implement something like that until further down the road. We also have to keep in mind that this is in the context of a global pandemic, which could, as I'm sure you know, unless you've been living under a rock for the last month, create a worldwide recession. So from here, the situation is either going to get worse or much worse. The Chinese themselves have not completely gotten over the risks associated with the coronavirus outbreak itself, though the numbers are down quite a lot. We talked about this in our last episode. There are still risks of either another outbreak once everybody gets back to work. We know that people are still heading back from their homes to the workplace, and there are risks associated with that, with a re-emergence around the country. And there is also the risk of re-entry into the Chinese jurisdiction through a major international port, whether from foreigners coming to China or from Chinese coming from overseas. The tomb sweeping holiday is coming up, and this typically sees millions of Chinese living overseas coming back to China. So there is this risk of the virus coming back into China, and then the authorities need to decide again, do we want to shut down our economy like we did in late January, early February to prevent this, or do we want to implement policies similar to what we've seen in more industrialized countries where you have a balance between the two health and economic concerns? So China is definitely not out of the woods. Even if China does not have another outbreak of the virus, its economy still relies heavily on its export sector. Now, exports have not been the largest driver of the Chinese economy since 2008, 2009, where it moved more towards investment and consumption being the main driver, but exports are still important. And if you have a major reduction in demand from major markets like in the US or in the EU, and that has a direct impact on production within China itself. So these numbers are bad. Best case scenario, it's only as bad as we're seeing now, but there are so many risks that it could get much worse, and there are many complications and moving parts that make a sensitive, well-executed government policy difficult to implement, and so there are going to be more bumps along the road. Whatever happens over the next few months, I'm going to continue updating you guys. Even when I was in quarantine, I was putting up videos. I will continue to keep on top of this stuff in China. All the big macro developments will come out on my episodes at the end of the week. I really appreciate you guys following them. If you are interested in this stuff, maybe consider following. For now, that is a special economic update for this data that was released by the central government here in Beijing on Monday. I will see you at the end of the week for the regular episode. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you for the regular update at the end of the week.